G'day viewers, it's Michael here again and welcome back to Single Racer. And now in my last video I featured the early access beta version of the new game Automobilista 2, and one of the things I noticed straight away was it had a great what you generally might call head motion effect when you're in the cockpit of the car. Now, what I wanted to show you in today's video was that if you run both Assetto Corsa and Content Manager, you can actually do this in Assetto Corsa as well, and I'd like to show you how and a few settings. But one of the reasons I'd like to show you this is not only is it a great effect for mimicking VR-like movements, but it's actually off by default. At least that's how I remember it, being greyed out and off, and I just assume this is just simply to help out with frame rates. You know, the more things you add, the more the frames drop. But I have a mid-spec computer. It's quite quick, but not the latest and greatest, and I didn't notice any hit in the frame rates while putting it on. So let me show you kind of how it works. But just before we do, there are essentially two types of VR. There's your standard VR that I use, which is you know, the typical headset type version where you feel like you're inside the car. And there's another thing called Track IR, currently at version 5, which also allows you to look around. But they're both reasonably expensive. I mean, the lowest end VR that I know of is around $400 from Oculus, so it's not cheap, and this is a very easy and completely free and cheap way to get into VR, assuming you have Content Manager, of course, and it's very easy to set up. So let me show you that now. Okay folks, so here we are in the menu of Content Manager, and in order to make this active, where you need to go to is the Settings tab here at the top, and then select Custom Shaders Patch tab here. And you'll notice that some of the settings are greyed out, and that just means they're not active. So the one you want to initiate is if we come down here to the one called Neck Effects. So we select that, and now we make it active. And this will work straight out of the box automatically when you're in cockpit mode in Assetto Corsa. Whether it's a race or hot lap, it doesn't matter, but you need to be in the cockpit mode because it's trying to simulate VR in a sense, or more just a live feeling like you're in the car if you're not lucky enough to own VR or have a VR headset. And now, one of the things I want to stress right up front is I've only experimented with this a little bit. I'm happy with the settings I have, but I haven't spent a lot of time with it because clearly, as you can see here, there's a lot of parameters that you can change, so it's all a bit mind-boggling. And so I just you know, have a simple setup, but I still want to give you a guide to how you can experiment. But the first thing that I did, because I own VR and I do record in VR for the YouTube channel, but there are some cases where it doesn't suit it, or you know, I'm worried about frame rates or things like that. So I turn off automatically this setting. Now, Content Manager is tremendous in the sense that the way it works is so simple in a way that when I looked at this initially and wanted to work with it, I thought, how on earth am I going to remember what the default is? You know, trying to do I have to write down all the settings? But Content Manager is so good that anything that is changed is automatically highlighted in blue. See, so if I tick that, which is the default setting, you'll see it goes back to white. So another thing that I switched off here, but I recommend to channels like, I know two channels that use Track IR version 5, which is the Humble George channel, and also Yorkie 65 or 065, and they could possibly still use it with the effect because it would enhance the effect possibly, but they would have to experiment because I don't own Track IR, and that's why I turned it off. And now, just before we go into the settings that I'm happy with, which is the settings you can see here, I just want to talk briefly how this came about, because it was a pure accident where I saw two videos that had no relation to each other but very close together. And one of them was by a channel called R-VR Closet, and I was struck by how lifelike it seemed when he was racing the new game Automobilista 2, but what I didn't realise was because he has a separate camera and footage of him in the bottom left corner, was that I realised he had a motion rig. So it was the motion rig that was adding this lifelike feel to the whole vision as well. And then I saw a drifting video that featured this effect, but his settings, and I'll have a link to both those videos in the description, his settings are set up for the more manic version of drifting, you know, or more severe if you like, where the car's completely sideways and he's trying to look a certain way, the way you would as a drifter. But that doesn't suit me because I don't generally drift. And so my settings are more for sim racing in Assetto Corsa, as if you were trying to be live in the cockpit. So let me talk a bit about the settings now. And the first thing that struck me about Content Manager, now I have a paid version of Content Manager which has a few extra things enabled, but you can download Content Manager for free and you have access to still most of the functions in the program. But initially I was overwhelmed. There's just so many choices. I mean, you can just see just here alone how many tabs there are to pick from. But Content Manager is different to a lot of software where it's or at least I think it's very intuitive. So to give you an example, some options I raised the effect and some I toned down the effect because I felt it was too much. And I've got to say, when they're all set to their default settings, it's very good out of the box, the effect, but I just want to show you a couple of enhanced things. So the one example of where Content Manager is so intuitive is, rather than have to write down what all the default settings are or worry about how do I set it back to default, is as soon as you get to the default setting, it goes to white. See, so here the default setting for this slider is 50, and as soon as you hit 50 it goes back to white, so you don't have to worry about writing it down or where the default was. It will automatically change to the white writing or text when you get to the default setting. So I have increased this effect to 60 just because I want to enhance the effect. But what I noticed was, as I was coming into the apex of the corner, and what I'll have at the end of this instructional part of the video is I'll have a demo, a 3-lap demo to show you the final effect. But I noticed that at the apex the head started to look, it's a setting here, these two settings here, started to look at the apex, and it felt kind of unnatural to me. So I want to show you specifically these two settings where, now if I can just find as an example the default, so there it is there, 50, and one setting affects the other. So let me get that to the default where it goes white. So it's very easy to detect if I can just get the mouse to stay there. Yes, so these two settings work together, but my advice is to move the first setting first setting first, and then alter the second, because the first, as you slide the first slider, it moves the second one, but it's essentially just working together. So I settled on 20 because I wanted to tone it down here, and then I moved this down also to 60 Now it doesn't change to the top setting, but you see the slider working together. So they're set together. And what that means is as I come to the apex, it's more a human or lifelike looking at the apex. So your head turns in an opposite direction in a sense to the car being stable. But it just makes you feel like you're looking at the apex truly as if you would in real life. And now another setting, or a couple of settings that I toned down, because I do have to say that right out of the box it is very good, but I just wanted to sort of enhance it because I'm so used to VR to try and more feel like a human person looking as you would if you were driving your real car. So I toned these two down. But what I recommend here is, the great thing about the way Content Manager works is everything here, including the actual active, is that everything that I've changed is automatically highlighted in blue, so you can see straight away what I've changed. But what I recommend, or the way to go about this if you don't like my settings or something feels unnatural, or you have the time and you want to experiment with every single setting, my advice is, and I'll show you this here as an actual effect within the car, is what I was doing was in order to truly understand the effect that the slider was having, I would go here, for example, to 0, drive the car for 5 seconds, 10 seconds, just enough to get the feeling of what it might look like, and then put it up to 100. And then, so when you have that dramatic effect between 100 and 0, you get to understand what the slider or the effect of the slider is doing for you, and that way you can better judge, you know, do you want it lower or higher to enhance or decrease the effect. So I'll put it back to 10 where I had it as default. And now after doing that, I decided that this setting here was best left at its default, neither increasing it or lowering it. But just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, because some sliders will go up to the natural 100, but let me do it on the steering slider here, which will go up to 250, just to over exaggerate and show you what too much setting can give you as far as a visual example. And so hopefully you could see there how, at least in my eyes, it was too dramatic. It didn't have a good desired effect. So I decided with this one that it wasn't good toned down or toned up, and just left it at its 10 default. But so here is my final settings, with the one exception, which is this setting over here, which I actually thought was perfect, and it's perfect for this track, which is Magione. But I didn't realize, and this is where it's good to have you know, maybe a variation, or have a possible couple of settings which you could save as presets actually, which is it seemed perfect for Magione, because Magione, I didn't realize at the time, is a completely flat track, no hills, no camber, no banked turns, nothing. And then I drove it on Bathurst and it just went all weird, and it was, because this is up to maximum, it just was a horrible effect. It's too hard to explain. So I have this set to 100 by choice on a perfectly flat track, but then on Bathurst I tone it down all the way to 50 here, and I can alternate between the two depending on what the track gives me as far as its hills and how flat it is. So it's a key thing, that knowing that you can change it on the fly and even save it as a preset. But on this particular track I'm going to set it to its highest at 100 just to show you the effect. But just before I do that, because I do want to show you what the difference was or the reason that I have this set up so high, because on this effect here I can show you easily just by turning the wheel, but this is harder to explain. So I just want to show you briefly in VR, or using VR to help make you understand what this setting does, because it's very hard to show just by sitting in the car and trying to do something. It's better to show you in VR. So let's quickly have a look at that now, and that'll be the final thing before we go racing. Okay folks, so here I am in the car in VR, and in my mind I'm at the right place, and the way I judge that is that if I move back, I'm where my head should be connected to the neck of the body here, so I feel I'm in the right place. And although that horizon lock set to 100 would naturally make you feel like what it means is as you turn to look at apexes, you're following the horizon in a straight line like this. But the hard thing about setting this up in the same way that it's hard to set up a car, and a lot of people, including myself, find it difficult to set up the car, is that when you make a change to one thing only, it's easy to work out. But when you change something else, then you don't know how it affects the original thing you've changed, and how they, or in other words, how they work together. And so what I noticed was having the horizon lock on at 100 on a flat track like this, was the feeling I got was as the app made me look into the apex and I looked down like that, rather than sort of come up and be straight and look like this, it was a sort of a violent straightening. It just seemed to somehow even out the look up. So as I would approach the corner, so if I can do it here, is the slider that has the setting when to look at the apex that I made shorter, is that the eyes would start to look at the apex. But instead of this kind of flat thing, which the horizon lock would make you assume would be straight, I just felt it was a more natural tilt. And, you know, it just, with the other settings combined, it just made a more kind of natural, as though the head rose back up into the normal driving position. So let's go back now, finish off, and I'll show you in the replay what I actually mean. Okay folks, so those are my settings, the settings I like to use, but I do have to stress again that these, I've only played around with these a little bit. One of the most frustrating things was, other than that drifting video that I'm going to highlight in the description, there's no other videos that I can find on the settings of how to set this to look very realistic. So I think you could get much better settings if you have the time to experiment with all the sliders and maybe get a better feel even than what I've got initially just on these very simple settings. But the key thing about this is this isn't just for creators. I'm going to put this in my creators playlist, but this helps you just in your normal enjoyment of Assetto Corsa driving to get a realistic view, especially if you love racing in cockpit view, as most people do. And also remember that you can save multiple settings as presets and just flick between any particular changes you like to make. So I hope this helped you. So this is Michael signing out for Single Racer. I'll catch you next time. See you later, and let's go racing neck effects head motion style.